So before I move forward in the slide deck, I want to just quickly jump over to this VM and show you. So whenever you first download the tool, you get this dandy little zip file, and after unzipping that file, we have a folder within which we have quite a bit of documentation, one of which is that aforementioned Diagnostic Manager Advanced Installation Guide. So at any time after install, you can go into this, and this PDF is really, really helpful. Like I said, most of what I'm going over today is basically ripped directly from this guide, but it has a wealth of information beyond what we're going to talk about today. Today is just focusing on the core topics in terms of installation requirements. But much of what I talked about in our previous session on component architecture is all detailed in this guide as well. So please take a look at that. Additionally, we have some other guides of note. The reference guide and the user guide are both very useful manuals. User guide being, I'd say, the most useful of all the documentation outside of that advanced installation guide. So be sure to get your eyes on that guy if you can. In our next session, we'll definitely be looking at stuff from those two guides. So that said, let me jump back over to my slide deck real quick, and let's just continue on. So, moving along. So, hardware requirements for the Diagnostic Manager tool. Metalogix Diagnostic Manager requires the following hardware on any computer that hosts a component. So any of our components, be that a collection service, the management console, or the repository, must have at least 2 gigahertz CPU, and I'd be hard-pressed to find an enterprise server out there that had less than that. At least 1 gig of memory. Again, I can't imagine an enterprise server that has less than 1 gig of memory. And about 200 megs total for all components of hard drive space. So therefore, if we distribute these components between multiple servers, obviously we're going to divide that stuff up amongst the different servers. So as you can see, it's a very, very, very small footprint for this tool. It's a very light application. It's just one single service that does everything. No real agents, so to speak, that go onto any other machines. Everything can be contained off the farm outside of the actual production servers if desired. There is one exception to that rule, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but it's a very light exception, and an optional one, I should add. So moving along, let's talk about general software requirements. So Internet Explorer 7.0 or later will be used for our online help, and that's it. Basically, we have these CHM, or so-called CHUM files, that are packaged with our tool, and they leverage IE 7.0 or later. I think we're up to, I forget what the latest IE is, but quite honestly, 9, 10, 11, something along those lines. But so again, I'd be hard-pressed to find a server that couldn't support our CHUM files. But additionally, beyond that scope, we must have access to one or more Microsoft SharePoint farms with one of the following installed. So as you can see, it's basically every version of SharePoint going back to 2007 SP1, or even before that, 3.0 SP1. And 3.0 is kind of, SharePoint Foundation is to 2007 as SharePoint Server is to Services 3.0, right? So WSS 3.0 is kind of the light version, so to speak, of Server 2007, right? So basically, there's 2 versions of SharePoint per major release, and we support all of them up to 2013. So that's pretty straightforward, I think. We can move on. Our management console, and this is all going to be software specific. So for the management console piece, we can run on either 32 or 64-bit computers, but keep in mind through all of this that Diagnostic Manager is a 32-bit application. So even if you're running on a 64-bit computer, our bits are going to be installed to the program files x86 directory, and all of our connections are running from the scope of a 32-bit framework, just to make that clear up front. And we'll talk about what that really means to us later on. So operating systems, essentially, we go back to XP Professional SP2. And the latest thing we support is Windows 8.1 IE or 2012 R2. So yeah, we can run these pieces on anything up to 8.1 going back to XP. In addition, we must install Microsoft.NET 3.5 on the computer that hosts our management console. So that application is a .NET application, and he's leveraging 3.5 specifically. Moving along. to the collection service component. And the collection service is the Windows service that runs in the background and kind of does all the heavy lifting for this tool. Once again, he can run either 32-bit or 64-bit computers, but again, he's running from the 32-bit architecture scope, so he is a 32-bit tool. And again, it's basically the same set of supported OSs. I think we added the Vista Business and Enterprise to this list, but in essence, I should say, we go back to XP SP2, and we support up to 8.1. And these columns for 32 and 64-bit just means, obviously Windows Server 2008 and 2012 don't come in a 32-bit flavor, right? So we're only ever going to be run from the 64-bit. Those are 64-bit operating systems by default. The repository database component, which, as you may remember from our last session, basically stores all the collected metric data that we've been collecting over time and all of our configurations. The computer that hosts this component must have should meet or exceed the software requirements recommended by Microsoft to run and manage SQL Server. So we're basically plugging into one of the following SQL Server editions, and the operating system requirements are tied to which SQL Server we're plugging into, essentially, right? All it is a database, and we have to be on one of the following SQL Server versions. So basically, 2012 going back to 2005 SP1 or later. Please note that a lot of time, and based on this little check mark here, we must use a complete installation of SQL Server to host the repository. SharePoint, Windows WFS 3.0 includes SQL Server Embedded Edition, I believe. 2007 might as well, but we cannot use Embedded Edition to host the repository database. That must be very stringently clear. Additionally, we cannot use express editions of SQL Server. The reasons are multiple, but primarily it's just because our database, the schema for our database is a fully fleshed out schema requiring tables and functionality only available in these enterprise editions. So express editions of SQL Server are not supported, and embedded editions of SQL Server are not supported for hosting our repository database. Even if you have SharePoint databases hosted on those servers, our database's schema dictates that we must have an enterprise or standard edition. So I hope that makes some sense. Moving right along to the so-called component analysis solution. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and we're going to talk about why this changes the agentless concept, but in general, we can install a component analysis solution on any web front end in each SharePoint farm. So SharePoint takes care of replicating the solution to all the other members of the farm. So by that token, the solution imposes no additional requirements on the servers that host it beyond the requirement to be part of the SharePoint farm. Essentially what that means is, for those of you that are familiar with solution deployments in general for a farm, I mean, we deploy a solution or a quote-unquote WSP file to the farm. Once it's deployed on any one WFE, SharePoint takes care of replicating and propagating that solution to the other servers that would need it. So in our case, the component analysis solution is responsible for doing things like deep dive component analysis for monitored pages, i.e. when a page is loading slow, we can see what specific components within that page, i.e. web parts, HTML controls, web controls, are contributing to that load slowness. Additionally, the component analysis solution gives us some hooks to grab ULS log data. That's really all it does. Since it is a SharePoint side farm solution, it can be considered a quote-unquote agent in respect to the discussion of whether DM is an agentless tool or not. But it should be stressed that component analysis solution is a completely optional component. It has no effect on whether or not you can collect primary and default core metric data from each of the servers in the farm. It just gives us a little bit of added information if and only if you need or want it, right? So in that respect, it is an optional agent we can install to the farm as a solution to give us a little bit more deep dive information about certain things. So the solution itself can use a custom HTTP module to analyze any page that's based on a master page template that includes the additional page head placeholder. So this is a little bit of an advanced topic, but I like to put it up here in the out front just to give you an idea of what this tool is actually doing. So the component analysis solution he hooks in and really gets deep in those pages to get us that really specific information, and he leverages this additional page head placeholder, which is essentially just a single string in your master page responsible for allowing external solutions to grab stuff out, right? I mean, that's putting it very, 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 very simply, but essentially we depend on that. If it's not there, for instance, if you have custom master pages, it's totally possible that that page head placeholder may not be there. Unlikely, but possible. So just to keep that out front as to what this guy actually needs, right? The solution itself overrides the default page head to direct the request to the analysis components instead. So I hope you can see where that comes into play. So it's basically a traffic controller in a sense. If a master page does not include the placeholder, the solution will not be able to analyze page performance for pages that are based on it. Again, this is a slightly advanced topic, but again, I include it here just to give you a complete picture of what the component analysis solution does and what it requires, right? So I hope that makes some sense. So moving right along, accounts. So just before we kick forth on this subject, accounts are the bread and butter, the meat and potatoes, the main idea of getting a successful and complete installation and configuration of Diagnostic Manager. Diagnostic Manager is all about permissions. So let's just look at what the different permissions are. So for installing, the permissions we're going to require to install each component are pretty straightforward and simple. For the management console, obviously you just got to be a local admin to be able to install programs, right? For the collection servers, we need to be a local administrator, and we need to have permissions to create databases on the SQL server that we've designated to host our repository database. That means whoever I'm installing as needs to be able to create that repository database, right? For the component analysis solution, local administrator and be a member of the farm admin group for the farms to be monitored. This is part and parcel to the idea of these farm solution deployments. Now we have a little package, oops, keep accidentally clicking. We have a little packaged installer for the solution. It's a great little installer, but again, you could be locked down in terms of remote deployment of farm solutions. We can always go back and manually deploy the solution by normal means. And by normal means, I mean whatever method you normally use to roll out WSP files, be that STS-ADM if you're an old schooler, PowerShell if you're into PowerShell, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that makes some sense. Moving along, the collection service account. This is the big one. So during the installation of collection service, we have to supply the service account credentials that the collection service will use to collect our data. That account must have local administrator permissions on the computer that hosts it, sysadmin privileges on the SQL server where the collection service repository database resides. In other words, we have to have total control of the instance where our repository database resides. Now, if it's not possible to give that account sysadmin on that SQL server, we can give the following granular permissions. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but if you are a DBA and you're responsible for account management in SQL, this should all make some sense to you, right? So for the SQL Server instance itself, we have to have the public role membership. Now, when I say for the SQL Server instance, I mean the instance that hosts our repository. Public role membership, view any database permission, or the DB creator role, which includes that, and then the view server state permission. All right? For every SharePoint content database on that SQL Server instance hosting SharePoint databases, we need the view definition and the view any definition to, or grant it via that view any definition to so-and-so username from a query, and then the view database state. And then for the configuration database itself, we have to have the select permissions to that config database. So I hope that makes some sense. So essentially, we have to have, we need to be able to get to those databases and query information out in addition to getting the server performance metrics. We'll talk about this in more detail once we get the installation going, but hopefully that's not too daunting. It's a lot of text. Alternate accounts for collection. So by default, data collection is performed using whatever credentials we supplied for that collection service. However, whenever we want to add a farm to be monitored, we do have the option of specifying specific accounts to use for collection of different types of data. So those different types of data, if I want to specify alternate credentials to collect farm data, and by farm data I mean server metrics and topology, we need to have read access to the SharePoint farm configuration database. Farm data equals learning. Well, every night we do a topology refresh to relearn the components of the farm, i.e. if there's a new server added, account for it, if there's new databases, et cetera, et cetera. So that farm data is read directly from the configuration database objects table. So whatever account you want to leverage to do that has to have that read access to the config database. For the meat and potatoes, the server performance, the actual metric data, whatever account we specify has to have access to the Windows management instrumentation data for every machine in the farm. Note, normally, and I'm going to stress normally here, this is a local administrator account, i.e. if you give this account local admin on all your SharePoint farms servers, we should be able to get the data we need. However, local administrator does not necessarily always give the remote WMI access we need to get that data, i.e. a really buttoned down or secured or locked down SQL server may have policies in place that prevent incoming remote WMI connections, and that's precisely what our account is doing. Our collection service is sending a remote WMI connection to the target endpoint to pull data out of WMI, right? And WMI in and of itself is a topic of, we could have a full meeting specifically around WMI. Suffice it to say, VM requires the ability to remotely connect via WMI to get data. We'll talk more about this as we set up the installation. For page performance, it's just HTTP read access to any area of the farm, location, site collection sites, lists, etc.